That leads me to another question that came in of not all people are equally impacted by an energy system, whether in the oil sands or elsewhere. How do we negotiate the differential impact where the people most hurt by something might not see the benefit? So I wonder, Andrew, if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of questions of equity that come up with any energy system. So from one as small as my local solar system up through the oil sands to global and national questions of climate change. I mean, we're seeing that play out in the province constantly with the premier arguing for what should be federal versus provincial decision making with these questions of, what share of emissions should Alberta be entitled to or be able to claim, how much of the oil sands should be. So all of these questions have equity and burden sharing attributes to them. And then, of course, local ones, there are going to be people who are affected by the downstream impacts of development in a very disproportionate way. One of the questions I often ask my students, and I've done so this year, is just as a challenge question to say, do you think we would have developed the oil sands in the same way if they'd have been upstream of Calgary on the Bow or upstream of Edmonton on the Saskatchewan, as opposed to where they are located in downstream of Fort McMurray, effectively on the Athabasca? And that puts very disproportionate impacts on those further downstream populations. But in that case, it's a smaller number of people with arguably less influence over our policy. So I think those are challenges that we know well. I think, how do you deal with it? The first thing is information. And we've seen it. I'll use one example, carbon pricing, right? Getting out front and saying, this is the distributional impact. And importantly, not getting caught up in the averages, remembering that averages hide a lot of information. So one thing that I've seen, and I'll wrap up with this, I've seen a lot of my colleagues be content to say, look, 80% or 75% or what have you of Canadians are made better off by the carbon price and rebate combined. And what that means is that most individuals at lower incomes are probably made better off, but not all. And there are going to be people, and so delving into that, who within this group, even digging deeper, pushing further into the information and making sure that it's out there and in front of decision makers before they make the decisions, and then tracked all the way along is crucial.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew, for those points. And that leads me kind of to a thought and also to a follow-up question here about how often do we need to reassess these inputs to a system? So Evan, you're modeling very complex systems. How do you prioritize which parts of the model you're going to include, which parts of the system you're going to include in the model? And then how often do you need to be getting new inputs? So for example, in a bad year for fish populations in the Kananaskis, or environmental protection will be more heavily weighted. What kind of responsiveness do we need built in as well?
It really depends on the question, right? So what we can use GCAM for is long-term projections, and it simplifies a lot. As an example, the electricity sector in each of the provinces is represented as a number, essentially. So we're not looking at where those specific power plants are or even how many power plants there are. We're just looking at the total capacity of coal production versus natural gas versus hydroelectric. If you look at some other models, they approach the problem really differently. They're interested in the difference between base load and peaking, which is a sub-daily time step. And so they'll be concerned with where the specific plants are and how much electricity they can dispatch at short notice. For GCAM, if we decide in Alberta that we need more coal-fired power plants, GCAM can add an additional 10 megawatts. In reality, that would never be done. You wouldn't build a 10 megawatt plant. You would build an 800 megawatt plant. So each of these models has their own assumptions, each of them has their own simplifications, and they can only be used for certain things. And so if I want to know about future projections of stream flow, for example, I would use a hydrological model. If I wanted to look at energy dispatch within Canada, I certainly wouldn't use GCAM. But if I want to look at the sort of larger implications of energy and how that affects land use, because we could grow biofuels, for example, and we can put ethanol in our gasoline for our internal combustion engine cars. I can do that with GCAM because it does the agriculture as well as the energy, as well as the water requirement for that agricultural production. So I guess the answer is it really depends.
Right.
You know, what is the question and what is the right tool to get that answer?
That's very fair. And so now I'm wondering about some of those things you were saying are not captured in or not the focus of GCAM, which is like energy storage systems. And Pierre, that's your specialty. How do you see that? What do you see the role of small scale energy storage systems being in this discussion?
Well, that's an interesting one, and I'm trying to understand that. It very depends on many factors again. So if you go to without going into too much detail, if you have a lot of renewable systems on generating power, so wind and solar, and we don't have a lot of other means of generating electricity without carbon emissions, so like hydropower would be one of those, but in Alberta we're not really blessed with a lot of hydropower. So but there are options for that, right? So we can decide, okay, maybe we want to work better together with our friends to the west in British Columbia, which has a lot of hydropower, right? So if we would have an integrated power market with BC, that would change the situation quite a bit. But we can also think about local storage in Alberta so that we can store energy here to get through those moments when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. They will definitely happen, as Andrew, I think, can attest to, right? So, so those moments, we have to have enough power in place. And I think people are not willing to accept being limited in power. I mean, it's an interesting fact too. Like, I think North Americans are quite, we like our freedoms, and we like to turn on, for example, our air conditioning when I feel like I want to have it cool in my house. But for most people, it probably doesn't matter that the power provider is actually sending out an email or a message or bringing a news item into the media saying, we are running at full capacity, please turn off your air conditioner, right? People are like, well, no, it's hot, I need this thing on, right? So, and if you think about energy storage, that is the different means or different types of energy storage, like big energy storage systems that are run by utilities, or your energy storage at home. I have a lot of discussion with folks like, if you have electric cars, for example, you can use electric cars as a means of energy storage for the electrical grid. Like in Japan, that's actually one of the systems that's being considered. Would this work in Alberta? Would I be willing to have my car so at the mercy of the utility at any given time, or would I have to be always opt in? And would I actually do this if I get a message on my app on my phone says, do you want your car being like serving to provide power at this moment? Or would I say, nah, no, I better not. Maybe I want to drive somewhere tonight. So it's a very interesting question. And I think I'm always coming back to this. I'm sorry that I don't have a definite answer. It's like, to make these decisions, we either you do the draconian approach, you say, that's the way it is, or you incentivize them somehow from a policy point of view. Say, what, you get money for it, or we force people to, somebody has to pay for it in the end, or we let market forces work this out. But there's a cost to all of this. Sometimes it might be the time that it takes to sort it out. Sometimes it might be environmental costs that it takes to, or it's the freedoms that we pay for it. But I don't think we get any of this for free. So energy storage is one of those. There's no silver bullet, right? So something has to give. It's cost, freedom, and somehow we have to pay for it, right? So, or like environmental impact that we kind of have to live with, right? So these are very difficult decisions. But yeah, I think in energy storage, essentially the technologies that we need are there. So this is one of those things where I would say, yeah, we're fine-tuning them and we're trying to find better ways, but in general, we could make it work. It's just we don't really Like that's the thing. Like how, in terms of how do we implement it, right? So who's going to pay the bill? Who's going to be really on the hook for it? And who do we ask to make these decisions, right? And that's one of the big challenges.
I think, Andrew, I'd love to hear what you have to say about that as well.
Well, I was going to say Pierre's caught on to what was always the bonus question of my assignment, which is, if I wanted to be off the grid as opposed to just a grid-connected solar system, what would it take? And you really end up, you see very plainly, and I talked about the nerd value of solar power, but this is where you really do see how big those challenges are, is that I can smooth out my solar gen over the course of a day with something like a Tesla Powerwall, and that does a good job at that. And it wouldn't pay for itself in Alberta's market, but it, at least it would allow me to rely more on my solar power system. But if I actually wanted to be off the grid and not change my behavior, I would need hundreds of Tesla Powerwalls to maintain the level of electricity use we have, even with our solar power system that is effectively net zero through the year. We are very short power in the cold months of November and very long in May, June, July. And so we'd be buying very expensive technology that we'd essentially only be cycling once per year. We'd be filling up a battery with solar power in May and essentially setting it aside until December when we'd use it. And it would be a shipping container full of batteries to do it. And so it's if you want to maintain using your dryer and using your all of your appliances and all of these sorts of things, it's very hard to do. And scale that up to a grid level, I think you get a sense of how big those challenges are. And I think Pierre did a good job of highlighting some of the opportunities for collaboration, but also this question of, what are we willing to accept in terms of either changes in our habits, changes in reliability, et cetera, in the electricity system. The one thing, though, that I put my hand up for something slightly different, which is the role of information in this. And one of our future webinars is going to talk about literacy, energy literacy, et cetera, I think. But it's interesting to me how the blame gets placed on things which are new or things which are different. So the Texas blackout is one example. The storyline that got a lot of attention was this is because Texas relied on wind and solar, and the implication that somehow all of these grid engineers in Texas had never occurred to them until this very moment that the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. And that's not true. What actually happened was it hadn't occurred to them how much of their natural gas infrastructure wasn't winterized. And we see this same dynamic happen in Alberta a lot in the peak summer days. It's not just that people are running their air conditioners, it's that the river water that we rely on for cooling some of our fossil fuel power plants is now warm and can't do that as efficiently as it otherwise would. And often it's the coal plants that go offline during our summer peak periods as well. So, the narrative that gets crafted around, well, it's just dealing with when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine is not fair. It's also dealing with when our fossil fuel plants can't generate, when our interties aren't available, and when the wind doesn't blow, and when the sun doesn't shine, and dealing with the points when all of those happen together. That is the challenge.